Well, welcome, folks. I'm standing in for Mike Clare today, who's flat on his back with the cold that's leveling everybody in St. John's these days. I'm Rob Greenwood, the Executive Director of Public Engagement and the Harris Center at Memorial University, and delighted to be at a synergy session with a longtime colleague, David Freshwater. But before I introduce Dave, I'll do a quick round table. And because we have a small group in the room, we also have people online. We're expecting a few more people to join us in the room, but we'll get going to make the most of our time. So Jillian, you want to lead off?
Sure. Jillian Skinner with the Department of Tourism, Culture, Industry, and Innovation.
Hot off the press?
Yes. I'm Carrie Neal with the Department of Sociology.
I'm Fatima Sapieta with the Department of Economics and the Associate Chair.
Manuel Hackett, Manager with Health and Climate.
Alvin Sims, Geography at Harris Center Regional Lakes Lab.
And Taylor can introduce yourself as well as who's online.
Yep, my name is Taylor Stocks. I'm with the Harris Center. We have Tracy Hennessy online, Brendan Haggerty, Gary Wensman, and Kathleen Herwick.
Right on. I know people there with municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador and ACOA and various other organizations. So Dave, you have a sense of who's going to be in the room and online with you. We're here till 1:30, and Dave will present, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. People viewing online can enter a question into the chat box, and Taylor will read your question out. We digitally record the presentation and put it on the Harris Center website, but we don't put the Q&A session on the website because we want Synergy Session to be as open to whatever questions, comments you have. And Dave, I know from lots of experience, can be provocative. Dave is currently a professor of agricultural economics at the University of Kentucky in Lexington and an adjunct professor in the Department of Geography at Memorial. He's been a collaborator with Dr. Alvin Sims on the Harris Center Regional Analytics Lab, RAN Lab, for many years. And for several years, he's been lead on rural development at the OECD. In Paris, he says the glamour of commuting from Kentucky to Paris wears off after about the third trip. He's been the lead on numerous OECD reviews of country policies on rural development and innovation over the last decade. When I first met Dave, he was the Tennessee Valley Authority Chair in Rural Studies at the University of Kentucky. And I think it was he used to receive about $1 million a year from the TVA, his sole authority to determine how to spend that money on research that would inform economic development, that would create demand for the TVA, a power generator, and at their economic development network, they had their own economic development staff to generate development in their region. So when I was applying for the job for the Harris Center, one of the first people I talked to was Dave Freshwater on what kind of programs, approaches he had learned. And in fact, that's how I got the idea for our Applied Research Fund. And we've done that for 14 years now. So Dave has partnered a lot on different projects. When we had our 10th anniversary, he was our rapporteur for the conference. And then we did a Memorial Presents with the lessons after 10 years. And where do we go from here? So no stranger at all. He's in town to do more work with Alvin and our team on RAN Lab. And delighted that he could fit in a synergy session. So over to Dave.
Thanks, Rob. This might be a bit too cute a title, but it sort of conveys what I'm trying to say. There's a belief in people who do economic development that economic development is a city thing. That you can't really talk about economic development outside large cities, and large cities, the urban program, the OECD isn't interested in cities that are less than 250,000, and they aren't really interested in cities that are less than 500,000. So there are no cities in Atlantic Canada as far as the OECD is concerned. And that's just that's the reality of life. If you look at national policy in Canada, there's really no cities. There's 7 cities in Canada. That's it. And none of them are in Atlantic Canada, although they might give Halifax credit just because they need something in Atlantic Canada, not because they think it's same thing in the United States. There's 100 cities that get urban policy, the rest get crumbs. So if you're going to think about, this is the all roads lead to Rome part of it, but sometimes the roads lead to Lab City. And Lab City was picked for a reason. So what I'm going to talk about is differentiated passive economic growth. I've been playing around with this ever since I started with the OECD, but I really got interested in it, I guess, about the time of Krasnoyarsk. And since then, I've been working at getting a coherent explanation of how economic development takes place outside large urban areas. Because there doesn't seem to be one, and absent an explanation, you can't really make an argument. All you can do is appeal to anecdotes, and anecdotes, while interesting, aren't very persuasive. So, what leads to regional growth? I'm going to trot quickly through some economics. So, right from the wealth of nations, going forward, economists have been interested in national economic growth. And it's always about, well, if population increases, the economy grows because there's more people. And at the end of the day, up until this century, that was a big way we got economic growth. But in the industrialized economy, population isn't growing. And if anything, we're looking at population decline. But we still want economic growth because economic growth makes people better off. And no one's interested in being worse off. So we have to find another way to get to economic growth, and that turns out to be productivity. Well, so then why is productivity, where does that come from? And there was something I read about 2 weeks ago that said we have 20 times the number of people doing research and development that we had 20 years ago. And productivity growth is 1/4 of what it was 20 years ago. So if we're putting all our money into research and development, we're not getting a big return on that investment. So what is it? And in economics, the current focus is on endogenous growth models, mostly driven by innovation. And technological change, investments in R&D, that's supposed to be the growth. And that's very appealing for economists because it leads to closed models that have nice mathematical solutions, and they fit tightly into general equilibrium approaches. So it generates really good theory. Trouble is, if that's how growth is supposed to have occurred, we didn't have science-based policy before the late 19th century, yet we had the Industrial Revolution. So how did that happen if we didn't have science-based innovation? Where did that innovation come from? And we have a lot of innovation that isn't science-based today. Now, social media, which is a huge innovation, none of those people finished university. Billionaires have changed the way society is organized. Has nothing to do with formal R&D. So there's clearly other paths to coming up with new ideas and shaping society. So if you are at all interested in the economics of growth, buy this book. I don't get you royalties. It's a sort of an old book, but Guyan and Howitt have the classic book on understanding how economists see economic growth. And it's a closed system. It's often referred to as the linear model. You invest in R&D, the R&D produces patents, the patents produce either new processes or new products. The returns from those products and processes are high enough to pay for the cost of doing all the innovation research, including the innovation research that didn't lead anywhere because most science fails. And the economy can continue to grow in perpetuity as long as we keep funding innovation and research. And it's very nice. They're very elegant models. They have lovely solutions, and you can play interesting games, but you can only play one small game at a time. You can change technology through innovation. You can change financial markets. You can change the level of trade. You can look at stages of development. You can look at changes in institutions, but you can't look at all of them at the same time because the model blows up. So it's very good for asking very specific questions, but this approach doesn't tell you much about the larger question of what causes economic growth. Okay. And it doesn't tell you anything about regions, because what economists have focused on is national growth models, and they treat nation states and macroeconomic policies are the units of measure for this. So it's all about the macroeconomics of growth or the international trade of growth. But a region exists within a nation, and the OECD, since I started working there in 1994, has shown consistently that there is more variability in rates of growth within a country at a regional level, no matter what level of region you use, than there is across countries. So you've got greater heterogeneity within Canada than you have between Canada, the United States, Australia, Germany, France. Same thing for Germany, same thing for France. So we've got all of this variability within a country, but all of these countries have the same macroeconomics by definition. So the driver of growth can't be macroeconomics. It can't, because if it was macroeconomics, then we'd have across-country variability, but we'd have within-country homogeneity. So we got to look somewhere other than macroeconomics for the solution. That's the sort of logical consequence of going to sub-regional, subnational levels and looking at regions. And while the OECD's been doing this since 1994, it's been, they can show that some urban regions, most growth occurs in urban regions, but there's always rural regions that grow faster than most urban regions. But it's descriptive. It doesn't explain why. So what I've been playing around with for the last 10 years is, why do we have rural growth when we shouldn't have, according to the theory? So, and the sort of poster child for this is this idea of smart specialization. Smart specialization in principle, and if you look at it at the most fundamental level, should apply just about everywhere. That, why would people do stupid specialization? And there's certainly, and in rural areas, there's clearly strong and compelling arguments for specialization, which anybody who's worked in the rural area understands. But smart specialization has been captured by the formal R&D crowd. And universities are among the worst at doing this. That's saying that universities are the source of growth. Give us money, because we are the source of growth. And, this stuff comes out of universities, but it's, most universities, like I'm an academic. And the reason I'm an academic is because I hadn't figured out a way to make lots of money in business. I'm perfectly happy to admit that. So I would rather put my money on somebody who has an idea how to operationalize it than somebody who's interested in writing papers for peer review. So this R&D that generates patents is highly focused on computer technologies, video games now. After Angry Birds, everybody's realized that video games are a way to get really rich really fast. Biotech, pharmaceuticals, social media, financial intermediation, lots of, but everybody's doing the same thing. If you look at regional smart specialization in Europe, which everybody has to do because the European Union has now conditioned you getting regional development funds on having a smart specialization strategy, everybody's playing this game, including the rural areas that don't have a research university in them. when they shouldn't be, because that's not how they're going to grow. But because we don't have a theory of how rural areas grow that's differentiated from how urban areas grow, people just grab whatever the model is and try and make it work for them. So this is all good, but it's only part of the story. Okay, so there's this new OECD regional outlook, and this was just when I got to Paris in May last year, and I had this moment of epiphany that I hadn't, I hadn't figured this out before. So they've had this 20 plus years of knowing that some rural regions grow faster than urban rural regions. So the focus of the study was on productive regions for inclusive society. So it was all about how do we get higher productivity, which is the driver of economic growth going forward, because we're not going to grow populations. And they had a model in there about how this happens. And it was the same model I just talked about. Big tech cities coming up with innovations, the Canadian urban agenda, that the large cities drag the rest of the economy along, kicking and screaming, stuck in their backward ways, and we have to spend our money in urban areas in order to get economic growth. I thought, okay. And they had looked at TL2 regions. The TL2 regions are provinces in Canada, states in the United States, Länder in Germany, the largest subnational unit in every OECD member country. And they were looking at the 50 fastest growing regions, so they told this story. When I looked at their table of the 50 fastest growing regions, and I started looking at the names of the regions. And they had Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, because remember, this was between 2000 2013, and they had places in Poland that you'd never heard of. Guys, half of these regions aren't urban. They don't have a city over 200,000 in them. And they said, what? Okay, so now you've got a problem. You have factual evidence that half of the 50 fastest growing regions in the OECD at the TL2 level are not urban. And you have a story that is only about urban growth. You have a choice. You can throw the table away, or you can throw the text away, but you can't have them both because the table contradicts your story. And they said, oh, we really like the table. So I said, I have a solution. You need two stories. You need a story of urban growth, and you need a story of rural growth. And it took me a week and a half to convince them of the obvious. Because people have bought into there is only one path, and all roads lead to Rome. And it's an urban growth path. And Alvin and I have done this when we did the work for ACOA. There's some some of the richest regions in Atlantic Canada are small and rural. They happen to be sitting on a gold mine, okay? But they're rich. They just happen to be sitting on a big iron ore deposit. They're rich. They happen to be sitting on shrimp fisheries. They're rich. You can't say they aren't rich, but they certainly aren't rich for the same reason that Halifax is rich. So the dilemma is the accepted growth model assumes growth only occurs in urban regions, so you need a broader approach. And you're not going to find that approach in a guide on health, because tightly defined growth models can't deal with this problem, because they just don't work at that level. So you have to step back. And I found this guy named Joel Mokyr, who's an economic historian at Northwestern, who's been studying national economic growth for about the last 20 years. Really brilliant guy. And he's looking at what are the sort of big drivers conceptually of economic growth. And he has 4. And he's thinking about national growth. And he starts with the Industrial Revolution. That's how he made his famous. What caused the Industrial Revolution? Why did it occur when it did, and why did it occur where it did? And it comes out of the Enlightenment, which changed how people behave. And it starts with Adam Smith. Although that's number 2 on Mokyr's list, because he thinks that innovation is the big one now, and he's right. But trade, Smith's whole logic of the wealth of nations, which was a repudiation of mercantilist philosophy that we should export everything and import nothing, he basically said that, well, the big thing that trade gets you isn't revenue. The big thing that trade gets you is the ability to have labor specialization, which increases efficiency. And expanding trade allows you to reach economies of scale. So trade is the mechanism that allows you to produce more efficiently. Because you're more efficient, you can sell more at better prices. And everybody wins in that game. You win because you're more profitable. Your customers win because they're getting better stuff cheaper. So trade is the second one, is Adam Smith. The first one is innovation. And it's this main long-term factor for Mokyr. It's new products, new technologies, irrespective of how they're produced. Because he starts with the Industrial Revolution, which had nothing to do with formal science-based models, but it was people who, in a sense, it was user innovation. The first steam engine was to pump water out of coal mines that were flooding. So you had a problem with the mine flooding. You couldn't rely on people hauling it out in buckets. You needed some means to get the water out of the mine if you're going to continue to produce. So you have a problem, you fix it. That's user innovation. The third approach is Robert Solow, who got a Nobel in economics for his work on capital deepening in the classic growth models where it's capital labor trade-offs. You invest in new machinery, you substitute capital for labor, labor productivity increases, you produce more efficiently. The fourth thing that Mokyr identifies is institutions. And Douglas North got a Nobel for that a couple of years ago for his work on institutions. That sound social, legal, and political frameworks create an environment that allows markets to work better. If you got corruption, your economy is not going to grow. If you're Southern Italy, we know that Southern Italy has endemic corruption, and that endemic corruption has prevented economic growth from taking place. Northern Italy doesn't have the same level of corruption, and it grows pretty well. Robert Putnam wrote a book a long time ago about that, and it still holds true. So those 4 things, innovation from Schumpeter, trade from Smith, capital deepening from Solow, and better institutions from North, are the ways that Mokyr conceptualizes economic growth. These are the things that if you have these things in some combination, you're going to grow. If you don't have these things, or you've got barriers to grow. But we're interested in a somewhat different question. It's the regional level. And there's 3 things that are important at the regional level that aren't important at the national level. The first one is your initial endowment. What's your natural resources? What's your climate like? How far away do you from markets? And all of these, so this is first nature geography, which is very unpopular among economists because it doesn't fit nicely in models, but it conditions what actually happens. Economists like to talk about agglomeration effects, but agglomeration effects make no sense at a national level. Because the agglomeration effect is about according to Marshall, it's an industrial district, which is a region at best. It's a group of firms in the same industry that are co-located in a cluster that have 3 advantages. specialized labor, specialized suppliers, and the ability to learn from each other. That's all Marshall said it was. And everybody has taken this thing and shoved it into places that it does not belong. And macroeconomics, their agglomeration effects make no sense whatsoever. And then the third one is Jane Jacobs' idea that, in her book, From the Life and Death of the Great American City, that, and Jane Jacobs is very explicit that she's only talking about big cities, not medium-sized cities, not small towns. And these urbanization effects are the amenities that large places provide. Large places being greater than 250,000, greater than 500,000, where you've got all sorts of things going on that you cannot have in a smaller place. Okay, so the argument I'm going to make from here on is that these 7 things, these 7 large forces, when you take a region, you can look at it in terms of these 7 things. And if you examine regions in terms of these 7 things, you find that you understand why it's growing or why it's not growing. And all of them aren't equally important in all places, but in places that are doing well, about half of them are performing well. Okay, so this is something that came out of Krasnoyarsk that Jillian said. And this is, we started categorizing 2 different kinds of economies. There's a high-density urban economy and a low-density rural economy. And if you go down, and they're very different. And because they're different, they grow in different ways. So the high-density urban economy is led by the service sector, especially producer services. Vast amount of people in services now, 2/3 to 3/4 of the workforce are in the service sector. High diversification of economic activity, redundancy in markets. If you want to buy a car, you can buy a car from 40 different car dealers. So there's a lot of competition. Markets work well. The network economy, you got internet, computers, telecommunications everywhere. It's always the highest quality of those things. Highly skilled core workforce with a growing gap between skilled and unskilled workers. Economic growth is driven by innovation and productivity. A lot of that is the linear model, science-based stuff, because this is where all the patents come from. Research, it doesn't take place in places of 50,000, even if they have a university. Those guys aren't doing research. Job creation is driven by entrepreneurs, SMEs. Growth is driven by large conurbations because there's a big home market. And competition is intense in most markets. And it's an endogenous growth process. You can think of it as a self-sustaining reaction. That once you hit a certain critical mass, the economy grows through its own dynamics. And it fits nicely into Guyana health. It's the closed general equilibrium model that economists love. Because economists don't like having to rely on some external factor to explain things, because then you're not explaining anything, you're just saying there's some external factor. And your model's not very compelling. On the other hand, in rural areas, there's this myth that was perpetuated by the UK for a long time that said that rural and urban aren't different, because if you look at the mix between primary industry, secondary industry, and tertiary industry, it's about the same. And there's just as many people in education as a percent of the workforce in rural areas as there is in urban areas, except the people in education in rural areas are primary and secondary school teachers. In urban areas, there's primary and secondary school teachers, there's trade schools, there's universities. It's a much more complex ecosystem. Same thing for healthcare. Same thing for manufacturing. The shares might look the same, but the composition of what's going on in there is very different, because it's the difference between a high-density economy and a low-density economy. There are things that you can only do once you've got to a critical mass. So you've got manufacturing tends to be mature in product cycle terms. These are places that are producing commodities where cost is the crucial thing. Limited diversification of economic activity because you've got a small labor market. You can only do a certain number of things if you've got a small number of workers. You can't have a complex economy and have firms hit anything like the minimum efficient scale to remain viable. So if you're gonna be good, you're only gonna be good at a couple of things, not everything like in a large urban place. Weak skills, youth out migration, aging workforce, low productivity, except in the primary sectors. And this is the interesting thing, that productivity in the natural resource sectors keeps increasing. How do we know that? Because they're shedding workers and output's going up. Fewer people in fisheries, fish catch is just the same. Fewer people in logging, cutting just as many trees. Fewer people in mining, taking out just as much ore. Agriculture has gone from 90% of the population to less than 2%. The output's gone up. So we know natural resource productivity is incredible. It's the one bright spot, but because it's not in the set of things that everybody is looking at, we don't pay attention to it. Because we don't look at rural areas. We only look at urban areas, right? We don't have a lot of extraction. And local markets tend to be thin, weak competition, low level of pathway, formal R&D, but you still find innovation. We've got some interesting work at the OECD on, and I've got some papers on rural innovation that it just kind of blows you away, the things that come out of rural areas in terms of innovation. Okay, so these are the stylized models of urban and rural economies. So how do the 7 forces impact urban and rural regions? So I've gone down Smith, Solo, Schumpeter, North, which are the 4 from Mokyr. And metropolitan economy, you've got a large home market, you've got the potential for economies of scale, you've got large internal trade dynamics. So all of that works lovely inside a large metro area without even having to export. If you're going to get to scale in rural markets, you've got to export because the local market isn't big enough. So that hinges on having good transportation and having a price of production that's low enough that you can eat the transport costs. Because if you're competing with somebody in the urban market for that, they've got low transport costs, you've got high transport costs. No one's going to pay your transport costs, so you have to eat them. So you've got to be more efficient. So if anything, firms that export in rural areas are more efficient than comparable firms in urban areas because they have to, because they've got to transport down. And the OECD's found that. The growing rural regions have high shares of tradables. And the crucial thing for rural areas for Smith is size and skills of the labor force and transport links. Solo, not a problem again in urban areas because you can buy whatever you want locally because you've got a complex economy that makes everything. So if you need machinery, you can get the latest machinery. You just have to call 3 people and they'll give you competitive bids. In rural areas, that's much harder. You have to know who to call. And they may have something that's not quite right, but that's all you're going to get. So, and then you're going to find somebody that's going to finance it for you. And your local bank might not be in the business of making that kind of business loan. So you're out of luck. So you've got, the Solo model is hugely conditional on having access to the right kind of financing to make the investments in equipment, in capital and technology that you need to make in order to be competitive. Schumpeter, clearly the formal R&D takes place in large metro areas, not anywhere else. If you look at patent counts, it's all urban. It's all big urban. And it's really just a very small number of big urban at the end of the day. And in rural areas, you either have to import the innovation from somewhere else or rely on a small pool of local entrepreneurs who have a problem they have to fix. Okay, so tree harvesters. You know what tree harvester is? Tree harvester is this big thing, goes in the forest, grabs hold of a tree, cuts it off, shoots up, takes all the limbs off, takes it, flips it, dumps in the pile, it has reduced the labor. It was invented by some Finnish engineer in a little town in Finland who had this idea. No R&D. No, he was working in a lumber company. He wanted to figure out how to cut the trees down there. That was his problem. That was his job, was to try to increase efficiency in the woodlot. Basically, it's eliminated half the jobs in rural Finland because the men all used to go out and work, cutting down trees, and one tree harvester replaces 50 guys with chainsaws. So, I mean, this is an example of a game-changing innovation. Walmart started in Bentonville, Arkansas, when Sam Walton bought a couple of stores and he had a logistics problem. He had to figure out how to get his stuff from a warehouse to each of his stores. And Walmart grew largely in rural America under the radar, and in the process of getting bigger and bigger and having small stores spread over large distances, developed the world's best logistics process in terms of siting warehouses, connecting inventory in the store to inventory in the warehouse. And when they moved to cities, they destroyed all the big retailers who had been sitting around being very fat and lazy. Rural company, no R&D, no patents, changed the way retailers go. Amazon, no R&D there. Jeff Bezos went out to Seattle and started selling books out of his garage and developed another logistics platform. Has completely changed how we buy stuff. So these, you can find things that have no obvious connection to the way we think the world should evolve, because it's people who have a vision. R&D is really brute force. You have an endpoint, and you keep conducting experiments, changing one thing at a time until you find something that works. Inspiration is seeing the solution. I wanted to be a math major, and I realized after 3 weeks of math, I lacked proper intuition. My friends saw the solution. I didn't see it. And it's exactly that. That's the part of innovation that we have lost track of, but that's the part where you make all the really important findings. The brute force refines things. It doesn't create big new ideas because it can't. Because you're always making marginal changes, and marginal changes never give you big leaps. By definition, they can't. Okay, so Schumpeter, and then north, you've got lots of different organizations. Some work, some don't. You've got coordination problems in urban areas. Rural areas, you've got few formal institutions, but strong informal institutions. There's a paper in sociology, Radebetter's paper, which is the most cited paper in academia on weak and strong ties, that says that you've got bonding capital and bridging capital. In rural areas, you've got really strong bonding capital, but you don't know very many people, so your bridging capital is really weak. Converse in urban areas, it's the bridging capital that you need in order to get better at things. Because if you have bonding capital, you just reinforce what you know. You don't learn things that are new, because you're not talking to anybody that knows things that you don't know. You're only talking to people who know the same things. Classic problem of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's a closed society. It's the classic problem of Appalachia. Closed society. Classic problem of Southern Italy. Closed societies. Okay, so metropolitan economy. One of the interesting characteristics of metropolitan economy is it has largely escaped First Nature geography. It's all about built environment. And what we have in a built environment is humanity imposing its will on nature. And all of these processes take place irrespective of what nature gives you. So the notion of an urban environment is an environment that is not nature driven. The notion of a rural environment is an environment that is still nature-driven. Even if you've got things that take place indoors, you're still subject to snowfall and roads being closed, power outages, and all the things that happen in an area that's not fully urbanized. Marshall's supply chains, really kind of an urban thing. I can think of supply chains in rural areas. In Casey County, which is south of Lexington, southwest of Lexington, has about 25,000 people in it. Just about every metal farm gate that's made in North America is made by one of 6 farm gate manufacturers who are along with Highway 27 in Casey County. Why are they there? Who the hell knows? Do they cooperate? No, they steal each other's workers. But they have a lot on the farm gate. And the only thing that differentiates those farm gates is the color they're painted. There's the red gate company, there's the blue gate company, there's the green gate company. But it is a classic definition of a cluster, but it doesn't fit any of the crap about clusters working together and, learning from each other and sharing, the Emilio Romano idealized world of cluster development. Same thing is true in Somerset. They build $500,000 houseboats. There's 5 houseboat manufacturers in Somerset, which is a town of about 30,000 people. And they've got a lock on the large houseboat market in North America, and they export to other parts of the world. They compete. They don't cooperate. But it's the houseboat cluster. So the clusters don't fit the stereotype necessarily that academics are promoting as the way the world inevitably has to evolve. Clusters come in all sorts of ways, shapes, and forms. And clearly, the Jane Jacobs story, by definition, doesn't apply in rural areas. You don't get urbanization effects when you don't have urban. Okay, so this you can't see for sure, but what I've tried to do here is connect these ideas to policies. And I'm just going to go down the policy column and say, what can you do in a rural area to get to where you need to be in order to get economic growth? Well, you got to help to identify and access new markets. And this is the story that the OECD tells in it's talking about rural development in different regions. We just did finish a thing on the northern sparsely populated area of Finland, Norway, and Sweden. A lot of this comes from that. And you got to find access for expansion. You got to provide workforce training programs because if you ask people to get better and increase their skill level, you got to help them get workers with those skills. You're not going to import people into most rural communities. You got to work with what you've got, which means you got to think really hard about how you do skill development, because skill development, once again, is conceived of in an urban environment where you can run a training program and have 500 people show up, and they can drive to your community college, and they can all sit in the rooms and go to the labs and do what you want them to do. In a rural area, you might be talking about 7 people. So how do you deliver that kind of training to 7 people in a cost-effective way? How do you identify those 7 people? It goes back one step from actually delivering the program. How do you get the right 7 people in the room to take the program? Because if you've got the wrong 7 people in the room, they aren't going to be worth anything by the time when they come out. The solo stuff, this one is clearly finance-driven. People can often find things that they would like to invest in that would make them more competitive, but they can't find a way to finance it because the inherent problem for a small business in rural areas is its only source of money is retained earnings. And it doesn't have a lot of retained earnings because it's not highly profitable. And it can't become highly profitable without investing in a way to expand its market and expand its efficiency. So it's this chicken egg phenomenon, and until you address the financing problem, there's no resolution to it. Schumpeter, rural areas, I think the big game is not trying to think about setting up formal research institutions in rural areas. But in a rural area, you've got a real opportunity to get large manufacturers to bring in technology that they've funded from somewhere else. So you import technology. And you can have some small scale stuff that is user-based innovation. I'm an agricultural economist, so I like to talk about farming. The whole, farming is hugely progressive. The farmers don't conduct the research. It's conducted by federal governments through research labor systems or by large corporations. That research takes place in the city. There is never any intent that the use of that research will be in the city. It's for use in farming communities. So the research doesn't have to take place where it's used, but the research does have to take place. And on top of that, you all see four-wheel drive tractors. These small ones here. Western Canada, Western Central US, you see big ones. Four-wheel drive tractors were invented in a farm machine shed in Minnesota over the winter by the Steiger brothers. Not John Deere, not Case, not International Harvester. The Steiger brothers, who took an old mine cart, which was articulated, jacked it up, put big tires on it, and turned it into a tractor. Because the existing two-wheel drive tractors didn't work on the size farm they had. So they had a problem that they fixed. And in fixing their problem, they created a whole new technology that was soon copied by all the big guys who drove them out of business. They survived for about 7 years making tractors, but eventually went. The classic Canadian example is Armand Bombardier. Why did Bombardier invent the snowmobile? He lived down a rural road in Quebec, and one winter, the plows didn't come, his son was sick and died. He couldn't get out. He played around with snowmobiles, and at that point in time, he decided that he had to find a solution to getting people to hospitals when roads were impassable. Came up with the snowmobile. Invented a whole new category of winter sport. Then came up with the jet ski. Invented a whole new category of summer sport. One guy. All of these are one guys in rural areas. And so you can see this is a powerful thing. The question is, how do you make it more systematic? How do you stimulate rural development? North, institution building, capacity building in rural areas is really important. One of the things that you find is that there's always the same 5 people in a rural community. Those people get tired, and there's no regeneration. Weber, your endowment is your endowment, but you can find better things to do. I'm almost done. Okay.
You break down 10 minutes, the usual.
Trying to be generous.
Yeah, the usual Greenwood stroke, right?
So you help people develop. In Newfoundland and Labrador, there's kelp that's being harvested for health food reasons, but medicinal reasons. That's a resource that people didn't know existed until somebody figured it out. So there's all these opportunities to do things that are undiscovered, but it takes people who come from somewhere else to see them often because they bring in a different perspective. So one of the interesting things about having a tourism industry, if you do it right, is you bring people in who see your place differently. And in seeing it differently, they see opportunities that you don't see. And if they're big enough opportunities, they'll invest. Alvin's got, where is it? Pacific Brigade? No, not Pacific. Bata Vista Peninsula, yeah. That's starting to happen in Bata Vista. And then Marshall, the cluster thing, I'm not such a big fan of clusters, but sometimes they grow up in rural areas, so you shouldn't ignore them, but I don't think you should spend a lot of time trying to create a cluster, because we don't know why they form, we don't know why they continue to coalesce, we don't know anything about them, and I don't think there is any possibility of coming up with a generic strategy. You have a whole bunch of onesies, and you can point to examples of success, you can point to examples of failure, but at the end of the day, you can't discriminate between which ones are most likely to succeed and which ones are not likely to succeed. You have to be aware that it's there, but and you can't do much on supply chains either. Although there's an interesting phenomenon. There's either close supply chains or there's distant supply chains. So if you think about your personal computer, it's assembled for parts from 80 different countries. So you could be rural and be part of the supply chain if you have the right competence. So you don't have to be embedded in a close supply chain. You just have to be embedded in a supply chain. In a rural area, the trick is getting yourself into that supply chain, becoming somebody that the supply chain wants to trust and can rely on to deliver what they want, what has to be delivered. And then the last one is the Jacobian growth, which clearly has a bunch of rural areas. That's one you can knock off. So, in rural areas, if you wanted to draw a simple conclusion to this, the most important things are innovation that you import or you develop from somebody specific, the trade and natural resource base, the institutions, particularly how institutions relate to firms and facilitating development of firms. And then in urban areas, it's the agglomeration effect and the local markets and the urbanization effect if you're really big. So you've got these two very different dynamics. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just the reality of it. What's wrong is saying that everybody has to fit in the same path. And until we get beyond that, we're never going to make much progress in rural development. So there it is.
Thank you, Dave. Tour de force.